The winter sky over the Russian principalities in the 13th century carried an unnatural stillness, the kind that makes even the wind seem afraid to breathe. In that frozen world of snow-drowned forests and silent rivers, an unspoken dread crept through villages, cloisters, and fortified towns alike. Rumours drifted across the land, whispers of horsemen descending from the ends of the earth, riding beasts that devoured distance, carrying weapons no one had seen before, and wielding a discipline that looked less like human coordination and more like a single mind spread across tens of thousands of bodies. Women prayed. Warriors sharpened their swords with trembling hands. Princes reassured themselves that their walls were tall enough, their faith strong enough, their courage ancient enough. But in the bitter cold of 1237, when the earth itself felt hostile and iron froze to the touch, something moved beyond the horizon that defied every belief they held about war, strategy, and survival. It did not look like an army. It looked like a natural disaster. Snow rolled aside in strange patterns as the first Mongol vanguard appeared, silent and deliberate, as if the land itself had opened and let them through. They did not roar, they did not chant, they did not announce their coming with trumpets or banners. They simply arrived cold, calculating, and terribly calm. Their horses exhaled clouds of steam that hung in the air like phantoms. Their riders moved with the smooth precision of hunters who already knew the outcome of the chase. And then the storm broke. The first Russian city to witness this catastrophe was Ryazan. It held proud warriors and ancient traditions, a fortress of wooden walls hardened by frost and centuries of conflict. Yet the moment the Mongols encircled it, the Russians realized they were not facing an army, they were facing an extinction force. Siege engines assembled under the whips of Chinese engineers appeared with surreal speed. Wooden towers taller than the walls themselves rose in a single night, as if conjured by sorcery. A rain of fire, stone, and shrieking metal turned the proud palisades into splinters. Within 5 days, Ryazan ceased to exist. But that was only the prologue. The true terror began when the Mongols advanced toward Moscow. The city had long believed itself protected by the winding rivers, the dense forests, and the brutal cold that kept foreign armies at bay. Yet these natural defenses meant nothing to a force bred on the ice-lashed steppes of Asia. The Mongols moved through the winter storms with an ease that felt inhuman. They dismantled and rebuilt siege equipment in snowdrifts without hesitation. They ambushed Russian scouts in forests so thick a man could barely see his own feet. And when they reached Moscow's gates, they broke through the defenders with a speed that contradicted every European belief about how war was supposed to unfold. Moscow had expected a siege of months. It lasted 4 days. 4 days to smash the walls. 4 days to shatter every structure of resistance. 4 days to reduce a rising principality to a ghost city whose ashes mingled with the frozen earth. Survivors fled into forests where wolves roamed, only to discover that the Mongol riders moved faster than hunger, faster than fear, faster than hope. The destruction was total, not a temporary defeat, but a calculated erasure. The Mongols did not simply conquer Moscow. They eliminated it as a political idea, as a node of resistance, as a future threat. They destroyed its infrastructure, its sacred monuments, its families, and its memory. They intended that no Russian warrior would ever look to Moscow again and dream of defiance. From there, the Mongol tide turned toward Vladimir, the strongest, wealthiest, most fortified of the northern principalities. Its walls of stone, reinforced with wooden palisades, were considered impregnable. Its citadel was a beacon of orthodox authority. Its princes, heirs of ancient lineages, believed that even if the Mongols were formidable, their city would not fall. And yet, as the Mongol armies advanced, the winter deepened into a monstrous force of nature. Temperatures plunged to -30. Blizzards blinded even the native hunters who knew the forests like their own skin. But the Mongols were unburdened by fear of the cold. Their horses, bred for endurance, unmatched anywhere in the world, could traverse distances of 80 to 100 kilometers a day and feed on frozen grass. Their warriors, wrapped in layers of felt and leather, moved with a frightening inevitability. And so Vladimir, the jewel of the northern Rus, found itself surrounded by an enemy that ignored the limits of weather, terrain, and fatigue. The Mongols began with a blockade so tight that not even a bird could leave or enter. Refugees fleeing neighbouring towns had already warned them. Surrender meant enslavement. Resistance meant annihilation. The defenders prepared for a long siege. They underestimated two things: Mongol engineering and Mongol psychology. Chinese-built artillery launched stones weighing over 100 kilograms at the city's walls. The Mongols burned villages surrounding Vladimir to demonstrate the cost of defiance, displaying prisoners in agonizing poses that crushed the city's morale. Within 6 days, after breaches opened along multiple fronts, the Mongol assault became a breathtaking choreography of destruction. Troops poured through the gaps. Others scaled the walls with ladders. Some infiltrated the city through tunnels carved beneath the snow and earth. The citadel held out briefly, but nothing could halt the relentless assault. Vladimir fell. Its people were slaughtered, its monuments destroyed, its sacred texts burned. The Mongols did this not out of senseless cruelty, but with a strategic intention: to extinguish the last meaningful center of northern resistance. After Vladimir's fall, the route to Novgorod, the wealthiest trading city in the north, opened. Yet the Mongols advanced only part way before turning back, not because they lacked strength, but because melted roads and spring thaws would slow their horses. Novgorod survived not by valor, but by mud. The greatest city still unbroken was Kiev, the ancient cradle of Rus's civilization. It was more than a fortress. It was the heart of Eastern Orthodox identity, the proud mother of Russian culture, a symbol of continuity stretching back centuries. Taking Kiev would not merely weaken the Russian principalities, it would decapitate their spiritual leadership, shatter their cultural narrative, and send a message so potent that Europe itself would tremble. In 1240, the Mongols encircled Kiev. The city, with stone walls rising 15 meters high, towers looming over the plains, and a population surpassing 50,000, had once believed itself invincible. But by the time the Mongols approached, the world had changed. Stories of Ryazan's obliteration, Moscow's disappearance, Vladimir's massacre, all these tales arrived like nightmares brought by survivors who could barely speak through their trauma. Still, Kiev resisted. Perhaps it felt it had no choice. Perhaps it felt destiny demanded courage. The Mongols answered with overwhelming precision. Siege works emerged like a second city built in the snow earthworks, timber fortifications, firing platforms, and engines that hurled fire and stone with remorseless accuracy. The assault began with a bombardment so intense that the ground shook beneath the defenders' feet. Wooden roofs burst into flame, walls cracked, panic spread. The Mongols intensified their attack with incendiary weapons, turning sections of the city into infernos. Then, with breaches open along several fronts, they launched a coordinated assault from multiple directions. Ladders clattered against the walls, siege towers shadowed the battlements, and artillery fire prevented defenders from regrouping or repairing. 9 days later, Kiev's sacred heart was silent. The Mongols did not merely win, they extinguished the ancient capital with a brutality surpassing even their previous campaigns. Corpses filled the streets for months, according to travelers who ventured through the ruins. Churches were demolished, libraries burned, families vanished. Kiev, which had stood for centuries as the mother of Rus, collapsed into ash and memory. And still, this was not the end. Having shattered the Russian principalities, the Mongols pressed forward into Central Europe with a chilling understanding of their own momentum. They moved into Poland and Hungary lands, whose rulers had no unified command, whose knights fought as individuals rather than as coordinated units, whose armies were powerful but structurally unprepared for a force that did not obey European rules of battle. At Legnitz, the Mongols dismantled Polish and German military orders with the same tactics that had destroyed Russia: feigned retreats, encirclements, composite bows fired at distance, and perfectly timed assaults. But the climax came in Hungary, at the Battle of Mohi in April 1241. The Hungarian kingdom believed the Mongols could be resisted. Their knights wore heavy armour and carried centuries of chivalric traditions. Their infantry formed wagon fortifications. Their commanders expected that a fortified camp would neutralize Mongol mobility. But the Mongols did what they always did: adapted. They divided into multiple columns. They used Chinese siege weapons to break wagon defences. They lured knights into fatal traps. They attacked from angles that no European general had considered. And when the Hungarian lines collapsed, they slaughtered the defenders so thoroughly that Hungary ceased to be a functional state for years afterward. The Mongols were poised to enter Austria, Italy, and the heart of Western Europe. Kings trembled, popes prayed, cities built new walls, and then, suddenly, the impossible happened. The Mongols turned back. Europe sighed in relief. Historians debated for centuries whether divine intervention had saved the West. But the truth was more mundane and more tragic. The great Khan Urgedai had died, and Mongol law demanded that every prince return home to elect a new ruler. Europe had been spared not by strength, but by politics an ocean away. Yet the shadow of the Mongols lingered. Their invasion exposed every weakness in the European military system, shattered the Russian principalities, and demonstrated that no fortress, no climate, no kingdom was beyond the reach of a force that moved with such precision and purpose. And now, after hearing the beginning of this story, after witnessing how a force from the farthest edges of Asia carved through the frozen heart of Europe, you may feel the same question rising in your mind that haunted medieval chroniclers. How did they do it? How did they move with such speed? How did they dominate not just armies but entire civilizations? And what happened next? If you want to continue this journey through the rise, expansion, and ultimate transformation of the Mongol Empire, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more powerful historical narratives like this one, crafted with care, depth, and passion. Let's continue uncovering the secrets of the world together. And yet, even with all this devastation laid bare before us, the true magnitude of what the Mongols accomplished during these frozen campaigns remains difficult to grasp. The Russian chronicles speak of fire and steel, of screams swallowed by winter winds. But there was something deeper, something invisible that travelled with the Mongol host. It was not only destruction they carried across the snowbound world, it was a new logic of warfare, a logic that Europe had never encountered and did not yet know how to name. Every European army that rose to oppose them assumed that courage could compensate for doctrine, that faith could bridge the widening gap between antiquated tactics and the terrifying future. They believed walls could keep the world outside. They believed knights clad in iron represented the height of military evolution. They believed, above all, that war was a matter of honour and frontal confrontation. But the Mongols did not fight according to the rhythms of chivalry or Christian valour. They fought like mathematicians of death, measuring distance, timing, geography, psychology, and morale with the same cold precision that a master sculptor measures stone. They played with perception, making their armies appear larger, faster, omnipresent. They struck where defenders felt safest. They withdrew when an enemy wished them to commit. They returned when that enemy dared to hope. The chroniclers called their approach sorcery, but it was something far more frightening. It was modernity arriving centuries ahead of schedule. For the Mongols understood a truth the rest of the world had not yet learned, that war was not merely the clash of armies, but the collapse of systems. When they shattered Moscow, Vladimir, Kiev, and the armies of Poland and Hungary, they were not simply destroying cities, but unravelling economies, clergy networks, trade routes, farmland, dynastic ambitions, collective memory itself. They created voids so immense that entire regions required generations to recover. And in the hollow silence that followed their departure, Europe sensed, with a terror it could scarcely articulate, that the age of old certainties was ending. Yet even this is only the beginning of the story. Before the Mongols became the storm that shattered cities and humbled empires, before their banners cast shadows from Manchuria to the edges of Europe, their true power was forged in something far less visible than conquest. It was shaped long before they reached the Rus principalities or crossed into Hungary. It was not merely their courage, nor their ferocity, nor even their extraordinary horses. The heart of Mongol invincibility lay in something far more meticulously constructed, a military system so refined, so adaptive, and so utterly alien to the medieval world that opposing it felt like trying to hold back a tide with bare hands. To understand how the Mongols achieved what no empire before or after them ever matched, the fastest and most expansive series of conquests in recorded history, one must step away from the burning cities and the thunder of hooves and instead slip into the quiet, disciplined structure that lay beneath. It was in this structure, this unseen mathematics of war, that their true genius lived. Every Mongol warrior grew up with the wind in his mouth and a bow in his hand, but that alone did not make them unstoppable. What made them unstoppable was the way these individuals were transformed into units, units into formations, formations into armies, armies into a single, conscious organism capable of thinking, reacting, and attacking with a unity that defied human expectation. Their entire army was built on the decimal system, an idea so simple it seemed impossible that no other civilization had perfected it. 10 men formed an arban, 10 arbans formed a jaghun, 10 jaghuns formed a minghan, 10 minghans formed a tumen. But these were not mere groupings. They were deliberate psychological frameworks, each level designed to dissolve the ego of the warrior and replace it with an identity rooted in cooperation, loyalty, and absolute discipline. A warrior might be fearless, reckless, even brilliant, but if he could not function flawlessly as part of his unit, he had no place in the Mongol army. There was no glory in individual heroics. There was only the mission, but the brilliance did not lie in the numbers alone. It lay in what the system allowed, the seamless blending of men from different clans, tribes, and even conquered peoples into coherent fighting groups. This was the true breaking of the tribes. The system dissolved centuries-old loyalties and replaced them with a new one: loyalty to the commander, loyalty to the unit, loyalty to the Khan. While Europe's armies often fractured along feudal loyalties, and Chinese armies struggled with internal factions, the Mongol army functioned like a machine, cold, precise, impersonal, and devastatingly efficient. Within every arban, warriors shared food, tents, tools, and responsibilities. If one man faltered, the others compensated. If one man fled, the others paid the price. This brutal clarity created a unity so profound that even defeat was absorbed into collective responsibility rather than personal shame. The decimal system made cowardice impossible, disobedience unthinkable, and failure a communal wound. The Mongols did not simply march together, they existed together. But the structure of their units was only the skeleton. The flesh, the movement, the soul of Mongol warfare came from tactics that seemed more like choreography than battlefield maneuvers. While European knights thundered forward in rigid formations and Chinese armies relied on predictable strategies, the Mongols moved with an agility that gave the illusion of omnipresence. Their mastery of the feigned retreat was legendary. The maneuver required exquisite discipline. A unit would simulate panic, scatter convincingly, and retreat in disarray. Most armies would have turned this into genuine chaos, but for the Mongols, it was theatre perfectly timed, perfectly coordinated, perfectly lethal. And it worked because it preyed on the deepest human instinct in battle, the desire to pursue a fleeing enemy. When the knights or infantry charged forward, believing victory had come swiftly, they would suddenly find themselves pulled into the open, far from their defensive lines, and surrounded by Mongol archers who were no longer retreating but circling like wolves. And the bow, the composite bow of horn, wood, and sinew, was the instrument that made this dance deadly. Its draw weight ranged from 80 to over 120 pounds, its arrows able to punch through armor at distances that European or Middle Eastern bows could not match. What made it terrifying was not just its power, but the fact that the Mongols could fire it accurately at full gallop, turning every warrior into both cavalry and artillery. There was no safe angle, no blind spot. The Mongols struck while advancing, retreating, veering sideways, or circling their prey in spirals so fluid they seemed almost supernatural. Their mobility was unmatched in the medieval world. Each warrior maintained several horses, switching mounts throughout the day. This allowed Mongol armies to travel distances that seem impossible even by modern standards. European forces trudged slowly, hindered by supplies and heavy armor. Chinese armies moved in disciplined but predictable patterns. The Mongols moved like smoke, They crossed deserts others saw as death traps. They scaled mountains others believed unassailable. They rode into winter storms that would have frozen other armies to silence. But mobility was only the beginning. Their adaptability made them a force that constantly reinvented itself. Steppe warfare was their origin but not their limit. When they encountered fortresses, they did not shrug and ride away. They hired Chinese engineers, Persian siege architects, and Muslim craftsmen. They learned to build trebuchets that hurled stones large enough to shatter city walls. They constructed siege towers, battering rams, and even early forms of gunpowder devices. They dug trenches, dammed rivers, diverted water supplies, starved cities into submission, or overwhelmed them with relentless bombardment. Where others saw obstacles, the Mongols saw puzzles, and they solved every puzzle. Their intelligence network operated like a nervous system. Scouts were not merely the eyes of the army, they were its memory. They could map terrain in their minds with uncanny accuracy. They could predict enemy movements with the precision of seasoned gamblers reading the table. The Mongols never marched blind. They knew which roads were passable, which regions offered grazing land, where an enemy might retreat, where reinforcements might come from. They recorded this knowledge, shared it, and used it to build strategies that appeared prophetic. Even their logistics were revolutionary. While other armies depended on supply caravans that slowed them to a crawl, the Mongols lived off the land, consuming curd, dried meat, milk, and even blood drawn from their horses during emergencies. Their gear was lightweight but durable. Their clothes insulated them from heat and cold alike. Their saddles stored weapons, tools, and small amounts of food. Every warrior was self-sufficient in ways that baffled European chroniclers. But the deepest secret of Mongol military supremacy was not a weapon, not a formation, not a tactic. It was the mentality and iron, relentless mentality, shaped by the harsh steppe, by survival, by the ceaseless expectation of mobility and danger. The Mongols believed retreat could be strategic, patience could be lethal, and discipline could be more destructive than courage. They believed the Khan's vision extended through them, that the fate of the world lay in their saddlebags. Their loyalty was not merely personal, it was cosmic. Leadership within this military world followed its own code. Commanders were chosen not by lineage, but by performance. A warrior who demonstrated talent could rise swiftly. A noble who failed could fall or be executed. Meritocracy forged an officer corps that combined brilliance with unshakable obedience. When a commander gave an order, it was executed without hesitation. When a unit needed to split, the separation was seamless. When two wings of the army needed to coordinate across vast distances, they moved as though guided by invisible threads. This merit-based system allowed innovation to flourish. While European generals clung to tradition and Chinese commanders obeyed rigid hierarchies, Mongol leaders experimented constantly. They tested variations of tactics. They adapted formations to enemy weaknesses. They incorporated foreign technology, and they rewarded creativity. The decimal organization made these innovations scalable. A new tactic practiced by an Arban could be deployed across a Tumen within weeks. Their ability to learn was exponential, and they learned from everyone. From Chinese engineers came the philosophy of siege. From Persian artisans came metallurgy. From Muslim scholars came knowledge of astronomy and mathematics. From Turkic warriors came new cavalry maneuvers. From captured enemies came maps, languages, customs, fears, and ambitions. Nothing was ignored. Nothing was dismissed. Nothing was too foreign to be absorbed. The Mongol army was not simply a military force, it was a living library, accumulating the strengths of every civilization it touched. Yet, paradoxically, it remained anchored in the simplicity of steppe life. The soldier who fired a composite bow with deadly grace was the same man who milked mares, repaired saddles, and slept under the stars. The commander who mastered the geometry of battle might still skin an animal or judge the weather by studying the horizon. This merging of sophistication and primal instinct created warriors with minds sharpened by discipline and bodies hardened by necessity. The Mongols did not pause to celebrate victory. They did not linger in conquered cities, drunk on triumph. Every moment, every movement, every breath was part of the greater momentum that allowed them to strike again and again. While their enemies rebuilt, regrouped, and argued with one another, the Mongols were already gone, marching deeper, learning more, tightening their strategies until their enemies scarcely understood how they had been defeated. It is tempting to imagine that the Mongol Empire was built on brutality alone, but brutality without structure is noise. What the Mongols built was not noise, it was a symphony of war. Every unit was a note, every tactic a rhythm, every campaign a movement. And at the center of it all was a conductor who understood that the only true limitation in war was the imagination. This is why, when their armies appeared on the horizon, enemies did not merely prepare for battle. Many felt the creeping suspicion that they were confronting something beyond battle, something that mimicked nature itself. A hurricane does not negotiate. A wildfire does not hesitate. A flood does not fear. And the Mongols, forged by their military system, trained by discipline and hunger, led by commanders who rose through merit rather than birth, became a force that mirrored the inevitability of natural disasters. Their organization allowed them to fragment into dozens of independent columns, yet reunite at the precise moment of impact. Their tactics allowed them to dismantle armies without ever engaging in direct combat. Their adaptability made them equally lethal on plains, mountains, deserts, and forests. Their intelligence networks allowed them to see farther than any army in the medieval world. Their logistics ensured they moved faster than any pursuit, and their discipline ensured they never faltered. To face them was to face a future no one else was prepared for. And this was only the military engine. What it ultimately enabled, the conquests, the cities, the empires, the rise and fall of nations, would come later. But at its core, the Mongol military system was a revelation, a demonstration that victory did not belong to the strongest, or the wealthiest, or the oldest civilizations. It belonged to those who understood the architecture of war better than anyone else alive. Yet even this extraordinary system, so disciplined and adaptive, contained secrets that lay deeper than structure or strategy. It lived in the rituals that shaped a warrior's inner world. A Mongol soldier was taught not only how to fight, but how to wait, how to read silence, how to endure time itself. Long before a campaign began, commanders drilled their men in the art of anticipation, a weapon far subtler than arrows or spears. They practiced moving without sound, sleeping in shifts that mimicked the rhythm of predators rather than humans, and maintaining formation even when exhaustion clawed at their bones. To outsiders, these habits seemed insignificant, but in the chaos of battle, they became the difference between a force that bent and one that shattered. Their training was relentless, but it was also strangely intimate. Every warrior knew the strengths and fears of the man beside him. They could sense hesitation in his posture, resolve in his breathing, readiness in the angle of his bow. These bonds, soldered through hardship and ritual, created an instinctive cohesion no command could manufacture. When a Mongol tumen charged, it was not the roar of men driven by orders. It was the surge of an organism acting through a single will. In the end, the Mongols mastered not only the battlefield, but the human mind, its hopes, its illusions, its blind spots. And that mastery turned armies into prey long before the first arrow ever flew. Long before the Mongols conquered kingdoms and crushed empires beneath the thunder of their horses, before Temujin became Genghis Khan, before the world learned to fear the silhouette of a rider on the horizon, the land itself shaped them. The steppe, vast, merciless, and eternal, was the first and greatest architect of Mongol power. To understand what the Mongols became, one must first understand the world that forged them, because every conquest they achieved, every city they shattered, every victory that stunned the medieval world began far earlier, in a silent, wind-swept childhood spent beneath skies so immense that they dwarfed human ambition. On the Mongolian steppe, survival was not a guarantee, it was a negotiation renewed every sunrise. The winters split the world in half, killing the weak without hesitation. Temperatures plunged so low that breath froze in mid-air and metal burned to the touch. In summer, the sun scorched the plains until the earth cracked open like a wound. There were no natural walls, no safe harbours, no abundant fields, only open space, wind, and danger. And yet, in this desolation, A people emerged who did not merely endure the steppe, they mastered it so completely that the rest of the world mistook their resilience for sorcery. Children grew up with the same unforgiving lessons the land imposed on their parents. Before they could write their own names, they learned to ride. Before they understood fear, they learned the distances a horse could cover in a day. Before they understood politics or alliances, they learned hunger, cold, and the quiet calculation required to stay alive when storms buried the horizon and wolves circled the camp. These early lessons were not abstract, they were survival itself. A child who lost his horse might never make it home. A family that failed to migrate on time could starve before spring. A clan that misjudged the intentions of a visiting group might be slaughtered by morning. Life on the steppe shaped a culture that valued mobility, adaptability, and instinctive cooperation. Every family lived in gers felt tents designed not for comfort, but for speed. A ger could be dismantled in minutes, loaded onto camels, and moved across dozens of kilometers in a single afternoon. A household that hesitated, that lingered, that clung to settlement, died. And so, the Mongols grew into a people who lived in perpetual motion, who saw the land not as property to be owned, but as a vast chessboard of opportunities and dangers, who understood that every horizon hid both survival and threat. Yet, beneath this harsh practicality lay a surprisingly intricate social fabric, woven from kinship, ties, alliances, oaths, and the weight of ancestry. Clans were small enough to be intimate, yet large enough to be dangerous. Loyalty was precious, betrayal unforgettable. A feast could seal friendship for generations. A stolen wife or a broken promise could ignite blood feuds that lasted decades. The political world of the steppe was not a stable hierarchy. It was a swirling constellation of rival clans, shifting alliances, and leaders whose authority rose and fell with weather, warfare, and charisma. No throne was secure, no victory permanent. It was into this world of constant tension and brutal necessity that Temujin was born. His cradle was not gilded. It was the inside of a ger lashed by wind. His inheritance was not wealth. It was the unforgiving wisdom of survival. He learned early that power on the steppe was fragile. His father, Yasuge, led a modest but respected clan, one strong enough to be noticed but not strong enough to be safe. Temujin grew up in a realm where every political agreement could turn violent with a single misstep, where survival depended on intuition, diplomacy, and sheer grit. And when his father was poisoned by rivals, the boy discovered the brutal truth that every Mongol child eventually learned. Strength was not given, it had to be taken. Protection was not permanent, only earned. And loyalty had to be tested in the fires of crisis. Temujin's childhood was not a prologue to greatness, it was a crucible. Abandoned by allies, hunted by enemies, reduced to starvation with only his mother and siblings at his side, he came to understand the world not through luxury or inherited sovereignty, but through hunger, fear, and the relentless demand to endure. This hardship did not break him. It carved him. It taught him to see the weaknesses of the clan system, the factionalism, the betrayals, the instability that dissolved unity before it could ever grow into something greater. While other boys learned to follow the predictable cycles of migration, Temujin learned to distrust tradition. While others accepted the chaos of steppe politics as eternal, he perceived it as a flaw he would later solve with a vision that transcended every boundary the steppe had known. But long before he forged alliances, long before blood oaths were sworn or enemies defeated, the land itself taught him what no mentor could. That survival favored those who moved first, observed quietly, struck decisively, and adapted faster than their rivals. The environment did not teach mercy. It taught precision. When a hunter missed his shot, he went hungry. When a clan arrived too late to seasonal pastures, their herds weakened. When a storm approached, only those who understood the subtleties of the wind survived. This culture of perpetual vigilance created minds adept at reading threats long before they materialized. From the land also came the Mongols' extraordinary connection with their horses, creatures that were not merely tools of war, but extensions of the rider's own body. A Mongol child could ride before walking. They learned not simply to control the horse, but to become one with it, to read its breathing, its instincts, its fears. Horses became companions, transport, shelter, food, and weapons. They provided milk, meat, warmth, mobility, and speed. They made survival possible, and later, conquest inevitable. This bond created a military advantage unmatched in the medieval world. But before it became a weapon of empire, it was simply the rhythm of life, the heartbeat of the steppe. A Mongol could travel across frozen plains for days with nothing but a leather bag of fermented mare's milk and the blood of his horse drawn delicately from a vein. He learned endurance not as a virtue, but as a necessity. He learned to read land not as landscape, but as strategy. Every direction was both escape route and ambush path. Every hillock was cover. Every river was a barrier or a trap. Every shift of wind had meaning. From childhood, the Mongols internalized the logic of the land so deeply that when they later marched across continents, their instincts operated with the precision of seasoned generals. Yet, beyond the environment and the skills of survival, deeper forces shaped Mongol psychology. The spiritual world of the steppe was vast and formless, filled with spirits, omens, and the will of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. The Mongols did not see themselves merely as individuals or as clans, but as threads woven into the fabric of a cosmic order. Success was not only earned, it was sanctioned. Failure was not only personal, it was celestial. This worldview instilled a paradoxical blend of humility and destiny. They believed their lives were fragile, fleeting, constantly threatened by forces beyond their control, and yet they believed that when destiny called, no force on earth could oppose it. This combination, fatalism and ambition, made them fearless in ways that confounded outsiders. Temujin absorbed this worldview deeply. He saw signs in storms, symbols in victories and defeats, meaning in every animal that crossed his path. But unlike many leaders of the steppe, he refused to let superstition limit him. Instead, he used it as a bridge between clans, between beliefs, between visions of what the steppe could become. He understood early that religion was a unifying force, a language that could transform rival groups into loyal supporters. His belief in destiny was not passive. It was an engine that drove him to reshape the world rather than simply endure it. As Temujin matured, he understood something most steppe leaders never did, that the turbulence of the steppes was not a permanent condition, but a symptom of fragmented leadership. He saw that clans warred not because conflict was inevitable, but because no leader had ever forged a system strong enough to transcend tribal rivalries. Politics on the steppe was personal, fragile, and temporary. Temujin dreamed of making it structural, stable, and enduring. But before he could unify, he had to survive. Before he could rule, he had to gather allies. Before allies could follow him, they needed to believe he offered something new, something beyond the oscillating chaos of clan politics. And to win their loyalty, Temujin relied on traits the steppe had drilled into him since childhood. Instinct sharpened by hardship, charisma born of suffering, a strategic mind shaped by scarcity, and a spiritual ferocity that convinced others he carried the blessing of the eternal blue sky. His early friendships, especially with Jamukha, revealed both the possibilities and the dangers of steppe alliances. Brotherhood could elevate or destroy. Loyalty could ignite unity or fuel betrayal. Every relationship was a test. Every test forged him further. The steppe taught Temujin that unity was never given. It had to be created, enforced, and protected. It taught him that leadership was not inherited, but proven through risk and sacrifice. It taught him that political vision required not just strength, but transformation. And while other leaders sought survival, Temujin sought permanence. This worldview, shaped by wind and hunger, by betrayal and resilience, by the harsh intimacy of nomadic life, would soon collide with the churning chaos of steppe politics. And from that collision, something unprecedented would emerge. A new political order, a new identity, a new Mongol nation. But that story, the story of unification, of alliances formed and broken, of battles fought not for territory but for destiny, was still waiting just beyond the horizon. Yet even as Temujin grew into adolescence, the steppe continued to sculpt every dimension of his character in ways he barely understood. Hardship was not an interruption of life, it was the default state. When storms howled for days and the Jur walls trembled like thin ribs in the wind, he listened to his mother whisper stories of ancestors who had survived winters fiercer than this, feuds bloodier than any now raging among the clans. These stories were not comforts. They were instructions, reminders that endurance was the first virtue of a Mongol, the one upon which all others were built. The landscape around him forced constant introspection. In the quiet moments between migration and struggle, Temujin observed the patterns of life unfolding around him with the precision of a hunter studying prey. He watched how wolves coordinated their attacks, how they tested the weakest deer before committing to the chase. He saw how eagles circled for hours before striking with sudden, effortless death. Nature itself revealed the logic of leadership: patience, awareness, decisiveness. The steppe never lied. It never flattered. It rewarded only those who learned to read its silent language. And Temujin learned. Every encounter, whether with a wandering trader, a hostile clan, or a passing shaman, became a lesson. He watched how men negotiated alliances, how they concealed fear with bravado, how they measured respect by the subtle tilt of a chin or the offering of a bowl. In a world without written contracts, every agreement lived in gestures, symbols, and memory. The young Temujin began to understand the hidden architectures of trust and authority long before he held any official power. He realized that unity required more than charisma. It required the ability to bind people with promises they believed in. One of the most transformative forces in his early life was the instability of belonging. Exile taught him the yearning for kinship. Betrayal taught him its price. Having lost the protection of his father's name, Temujin grew up as an outsider, even among those who shared his blood. Outsiders see differently. They question everything. They notice fractures others ignore. And in the cold nights when hunger clawed at his stomach and the fire dwindled to embers, he made silent vows, vows forged not in arrogance but in necessity. If he survived, he would build a world where no child would be abandoned because of politics, where loyalty flowed upward from merit rather than downward from lineage. He did not know yet how radical this vision was. He only knew it felt like truth. But perhaps the most profound influence on Temujin came from watching the way elders responded to crisis. Some broke, some hesitated, some clung to tradition as if it were a raft in a rising flood. Yet a few, but only a few, adapted. They shifted their strategies with the wind, saw advantage where others saw danger, and acted with a clarity that cut through chaos. Temujin gravitated toward these rare, flexible minds. They taught him that leadership was not a title, it was a series of choices made when fear threatened to blind everyone else. He carried these lessons with him as he grew. The steppe became both classroom and test. It taught him that alliances meant survival, but also that alliances were only as stable as the trust that bound them. It taught him that violence could build fear, but strategy built loyalty. It taught him that tradition could preserve identity, but innovation could shape destiny. Most importantly, the steppe taught him that a leader did not rise by seizing power. He rose by becoming indispensable. And Temujin, shaped by wind, hunger, loss, and relentless observation, was becoming exactly that indispensable. Not yet a Khan, not yet a conqueror, not yet the force who would reorder the world, but a young man carved by the land into something the steppe had not seen before. A mind destined to unify what had always been fractured. A will strong enough to bend the chaos of the clans into the beginnings of a nation. The horizon was changing. He could feel it long before anyone else. The Mongol Empire, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Eastern Europe, could never have endured on the force of arms alone. Conquest might carve a realm into existence, but only a different kind of power could hold it together. And the Mongols, for all their ferocity on the battlefield, possessed a brilliance that surpassed their enemies' imaginations. The ability to create a system of governance vast enough to bind continents, fast enough to outrun rebellion, and subtle enough to guide the ambitions of dozens of conquered civilizations. At the heart of that improbable machinery sat one of the most astonishing inventions of the medieval world, a device not of steel or flesh, but of speed, discipline, and communication. It was called the Yam, a relay network so efficient, so relentless, so elegantly simple, that it reshaped the very meaning of empire. Imagine a chain that stretched from Beijing to the Caspian Sea, from Karakorum to Kiev, each link no more than a day's ride from the next. This chain was not metaphorical but real, built of wooden stations, fresh horses, trained riders, shelters, stockpiles, and men who lived and died for the sole purpose of ensuring that a message could cross half the world faster than an army could cross a valley. The stations stood 25 to 30 kilometers apart, just far enough for a horse to sprint at maximum speed before collapsing, and just close enough for the next rider to leap onto a waiting mount without losing a heartbeat. Day and night, winter and summer, storm or clear sky, the Yam did not stop. It was the pulse of the empire, beating ceaselessly across deserts, mountains, forests, and steppes. To understand its significance, one must consider the world it conquered. Medieval Europe relied on messengers who wandered slowly through broken roads, forests infested with bandits, and kingdoms hostile to anything foreign. The Islamic caliphates possessed sophisticated bureaucracy, but lacked the ability to send a message in weeks rather than months. China had couriers, but its networks crumbled when distance exceeded the reach of one dynasty's confidence. Even Rome, the ancient master of roads, had never crafted anything so fluid, so adaptive, so perfectly suited to the needs of a continent-sized empire dependent on speed. The Mongols did, and they built it with a clarity of purpose that revealed exactly why they ruled more land than any empire before or after. For the Yam was more than communication, it was control. When a governor in Samarkand hesitated, a messenger was already on the road to report it. When unrest stirred in the Caucasus, word reached Karakorum before the rebels realized they had been noticed. When the Great Khan issued an order, armies, thousands of kilometers apart, adjusted their movements as though guided by an invisible hand. The Yam transformed geography into something malleable. Distance ceased to be an obstacle. Mountains became irrelevant. Time compressed. Authority extended with a speed that made disobedience almost pointless. Every station along this vast chain carried the imprint of Mongol administration. Fresh horses tethered and fed, supplies stacked neatly in wooden shelters, cooks, blacksmiths, veterinarians, and stable masters working in shifts. These were not outposts, they were miniature worlds, each one humming with the disciplined energy of an empire that understood the most important truth about ruling land. Communication is sovereignty. Without it, borders blur, loyalties fracture, and the vastness that once looked like power becomes a weight that crushes itself. But with the Yam, the Mongols achieved something extraordinary. They created a system where no part of the empire was ever truly distant. Merchants felt its presence too. Caravans crossing the Silk Road no longer trembled at the thought of bandits or corrupt border officials. Under the Pax Mongolica, harming a trader under Mongol protection was treated as a direct insult to the Khan himself, a crime punishable by death. This meant that the Yam stations, though primarily built for military and administrative use, doubled as sanctuaries for travelers. They offered rest, water, protection, and information. The roads became safer than they had been in centuries. Trade flourished not because merchants suddenly grew braver, but because the Mongols created a world where fear no longer controlled the rhythms of commerce. The Yam was not merely a relay, it was the architecture of trust across continents. Inside the grand administrative mind of the empire, the Yam functioned as both nervous system and spine. Reports flowed through it with astonishing frequency. Census data, tax tallies, grazing schedules, military inventories, intelligence updates from spies embedded in foreign courts, diplomatic letters from kings seeking alliances or begging for mercy, instructions for captured engineers relocated to new cities, letters of appointment, letters of dismissal, letters of warning. Every strand of the empire's political and social fabric moved along these routes, binding cities, tribes, kingdoms, and newly conquered lands into a structure that felt less like an empire and more like an organism. The Great Khan, whether Urgedai, Guyuk, Mönke, or Kublai, was never blind. His eyes were the riders galloping across the steppes at breathtaking speed. His voice was the sealed decree they carried. His presence extended into every village, fortress, and palace under Mongol rule. The Yam gave him omnipresence, not in a mystical sense, but in the practical and terrifyingly efficient sense that no one was truly beyond his reach. This was the foundation upon which the largest contiguous empire on earth was governed, not by fear alone, not by brute strength, but by a logistics system so advanced it felt like a prophecy fulfilled. But the brilliance of the Yam lay not just in its speed, it lay in its adaptability. When terrain became hostile mountains, deserts, frozen tundra, the Mongols altered the design. In some regions, they used camels instead of horses. In others, sleds replaced saddles. In treacherous mountain passes, foot couriers risked avalanches to keep the line unbroken. The Mongols understood something that few empires ever accepted. A system does not fail because the environment is difficult. It fails because the system refuses to evolve. And the Yam evolved constantly. This fluid communication network also shaped the empire's internal governance. A local administrator who falsified records or hoarded taxes could expect inspectors to arrive without warning, armed not with swords, but with documents collected from dozens of stations along the Yam. Patterns emerged where corruption hid. Discrepancies in grain shipments, livestock counts, and census numbers revealed themselves like bruises beneath the skin. The Mongol administrative machine was not gentle, but it was precise. It rewarded efficiency and punished incompetence with a clarity other medieval governments could never equal. The Yam also forged the empire's diplomatic identity. Ambassadors from France, Persia, Byzantium, and distant kingdoms travelled safely along Mongol roads, escorted from station to station in a manner that felt both welcoming and intimidating. The same system that carried threats of war also carried invitations to trade, treaties, philosophical texts, astronomical charts, and letters between rulers who had never met but recognized each other across the expanse of Asia through the ink of their messages. By connecting realms, the Yam made politics something that occurred across continents rather than within isolated borders. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the Yam was the way it reshaped time itself. Before the Mongols, news travelled no faster than the fastest horse a kingdom possessed. Empires expanded and collapsed, partly because their leaders lived in ignorance, reacting too late, misunderstanding threats, losing momentum, wasting opportunities. The Mongols refused to be victims of distance. They engineered a world where action could follow thought without delay. A rebellion in Bukhara could be suppressed before it fully ignited. A famine in the northern steppes could be mitigated before winter claimed thousands. A foreign alliance forming on the western frontier could be countered before the ink dried on the signatures. The Yam gave rulers the rarest and most powerful advantage in history: real-time awareness. Even when the Mongol Empire fractured into 4 khanates, the Yam did not vanish, it multiplied. Each successor state inherited the system because it had become indispensable to governance. No matter how fierce the civil wars, how bitter the rivalries, every Khan understood that without the Yam, the vast lands they claimed to rule would slip from their fingers like sand. Even weakened, even divided, they maintained the stations, kept riders ready, and protected the lines. It was the one legacy that none dared abandon. And long after the empire dissolved, historians marveled that such an advanced communication system existed in the 13th century, something Europe would not approximate until centuries later. In many ways, the Yam was a precursor to the postal networks of the early modern world, the courier systems of rising empires, the logistical backbone of global trade, and even the ideological ancestor of the technologies that connect nations today. It was not a mere innovation, it was a revelation. The Mongol Empire is often remembered for destruction, for fire, fear, and conquest. But the Yam reveals another truth, a truth rarely acknowledged. The Mongols understood that power was not measured solely in what one could destroy, but in what one could connect. In building a network that stretched across continents, they demonstrated a vision of governance centuries ahead of its time. They turned the empty spaces of Eurasia into arteries of information. They transformed an empire of disparate cultures into a synchronized whole. They showed that communication, when wielded with discipline and purpose, could become the most formidable instrument of rule. The Yam was not simply a road system. It was the silent architecture of an empire, the breath that allowed it to speak, the nerves that allowed it to feel, and the blood that allowed it to live. And through it, the Mongols achieved what few empires ever have. They governed a world too vast for any one ruler to hold, yet held it all the same. Yet even as the Yam accelerated the empire's communication, its deeper influence unfolded in ways more profound than the speed of a galloping horse. It reshaped how people within the empire understood power itself. Rulers who once imagined authority as something rooted in physical presence, palaces, armies, ceremonies, slowly realized that in the Mongol world, authority traveled. It had motion. It swept across the steppes, through mountain passes, along river valleys, and into cities that had never laid eyes on the Great Khan. This mobility of authority created a psychological shift. Subjects obeyed not because a soldier stood at their gate, but because they felt the Khan's gaze passing over them like an ever-circling hawk. The Yam made the invisible visible, and in doing so, it forged a new kind of political consciousness. Communities along the great routes began to adapt their rhythms of life to the flow of riders. Villages learned to recognize the thunder of hooves that signaled an urgent dispatch. Markets quieted when a courier dashed through, dust rising behind him like a comet's tail. Even nomads grazing their herds on distant plains adjusted their migrations to avoid obstructing the lines. In time, the Yam became not merely infrastructure but culture, a rhythm that synchronized the empire's heartbeat from one coast of Eurasia to the other. Local leaders, once accustomed to ruling with relative autonomy, discovered they were no longer insulated by distance or time. Decisions had consequences measured in hours, not months. Reports of drought, mismanagement, or insurrection travelled faster than excuses. Many governors began keeping scribes stationed near Yam routes so their own messages could intercept the relay at a moment's notice. This fostered a new kind of administrative discipline. The empire was too vast for micromanagement, but the Yam created accountability, a subtle pressure that encouraged competence and discouraged ambition that drifted too far from loyalty. The Yam also altered diplomacy in subtle ways. Foreign envoys, witnessing the relentless passage of riders, sensed that the empire they negotiated with was not static but alive, humming with energy. They understood that promises made to the Mongols were not made to a distant throne, but to a network capable of enforcing those promises with terrifying speed. This perception alone dissuaded countless rebellions and renegotiations. States that once relied on dense borders and natural barriers realized that none of these could stop a message traveling through the Yam, and if a message could reach them, so could an army. In its quiet, relentless efficiency, the Yam became the empire's greatest psychological weapon, proving that true domination required not constant violence, but the ability to remain present everywhere, even when unseen. And in that presence lay the secret of how an empire so enormous endured far longer than its founders ever imagined. Before the Mongols carved their empire across continents, before their armies shook the foundations of kingdoms from China to the Mediterranean, the world feared them for their brutality and marveled at their military genius. But history has a way of overlooking a truth that is perhaps more astonishing than their conquests. For beneath the thunder of their horses and the smoke of burning cities lay a quiet revolution, one not built on violence, but on tolerance. It was a revolution of spirit, belief, and culture, one that reshaped the religious landscape of Eurasia in ways more enduring than any battle. And its architect was an empire often caricatured as savage, but in reality possessed a depth of vision rarely seen in human governance. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, one must step back into the medieval world, a world fractured by faith, where religion was not merely a belief system but a political weapon, a justification for war, a boundary drawn between us and them. Europe waged crusades in the name of God. Muslim dynasties contended with each other for the right interpretation of faith. Chinese states balanced Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism through cycles of suppression and revival. In this turbulent landscape, the Mongols emerged not as zealots or reformers, but as pragmatists who recognized a fundamental truth. Faith could divide, but it could also unite if handled with the wisdom of a leader who understood human nature. Unlike the empires they conquered, the Mongols did not force their gods upon anyone. They believed the world was governed by Tengri, the eternal blue sky, but they never sought to impose this belief. They saw religion not as a battlefield to dominate, but as a fabric woven through the lives of the peoples they ruled. To tear that fabric would weaken the empire, to respect it would strengthen it, and so, in a time when forced conversions were common and religious persecution widespread, the Mongol Empire stood apart as a sanctuary of spiritual plurality. At the heart of this tolerance was a profound insight. An empire as vast and diverse as theirs could not survive through military power alone. They ruled over Buddhists in Tibet and northern China, Muslims in Persia and Central Asia, Christians in Armenia and Georgia, Orthodox communities in Rus, Taoists in southern China, and shamans across the steppe. If they demanded religious conformity, rebellion would erupt across the empire. But if they allowed each group to honor its own gods, practice its own rituals, and maintain its own traditions, loyalty would follow. Genghis Khan understood this intuitively. He had seen firsthand how tribal politics fractured over belief, how spiritual authority could both heal and destroy. And so, from the earliest days of the empire, he decreed that all religions were to be protected, that no priest or monk of any faith was to be harmed, and that religious leaders would receive exemptions from taxes and labor duties. This was not an act of kindness, it was strategy. But it was also more than strategy. It was respect born from a worldview that saw the divine as something too vast to be captured by any single doctrine. Nestorian Christians found refuge under the Mongols, their churches flourishing from Samarkand to Karakorum. For centuries they had lived in fear of persecution from both Islamic and Byzantine authorities. But under Mongol rule their bishops held influence at court, their priests advised great khans, and their communities grew with newfound confidence. Christian queens, educated and politically astute, played pivotal roles in diplomacy and succession. The Mongols, indifferent to doctrinal disputes, granted them a freedom they rarely experienced elsewhere in the medieval world. Muslims under Mongol rule experienced a similar transformation. In Central Asia and Persia, they continued to practice their faith openly, building mosques, maintaining courts of Islamic law, and preserving their scholarly traditions. Mongol rulers, even before their eventual conversion to Islam, engaged Muslim administrators to manage taxation, finance, and urban affairs. They recognized the sophistication of Islamic governance and integrated it into their own system. This partnership would ultimately lead to the rise of the Ilkhanate, a Mongol state that embraced Islam so deeply it became one of the intellectual centers of the Muslim world. But perhaps the most intimate relationship the Mongols formed was with Buddhism, especially the esoteric traditions of Tibet. Long before Kublai Khan built the Yuan dynasty in China, Mongol nobles had sought the counsel of Tibetan lamas, believing them to possess spiritual power capable of guiding empires. These lamas became spiritual advisors to the Khans, shaping philosophy, ritual, and governance. Temples rose across Mongolia and northern China, their golden roofs gleaming against the blue steppe sky. Monks served not only as religious authorities, but as diplomats, scholars, and healers. The partnership between the Mongols and Tibetan Buddhism was built on mutual respect, and it endured long after the empire itself had fractured. Confucian scholars also found a place in the Mongol world. Though Mongol rulers initially distrusted the rigid hierarchies embedded in Confucian bureaucracy, they recognized the value of its administrative wisdom. Confucian advisors contributed to the governance of China under the Yuan dynasty, shaping systems of taxation, education, and civil law. They found themselves working alongside Buddhists, Muslims, and shamans, a collaboration unimaginable in any other empire of the period. Taoists brought with them traditions of medicine, alchemy, and natural philosophy. Their insights into longevity, healing, and the harmony of the elements influenced Mongol elites, who sought both spiritual power and practical knowledge. Some Khans consulted Taoist masters on matters ranging from statecraft to personal health, and while Taoist influence eventually waned due to political tensions, it was nevertheless a significant thread in the empire's religious tapestry. And throughout all this, the old shamanistic traditions of the steppe endured. Mongol shamans walked among the people, invoking the spirits of the land, sky, and ancestors. They continued to bless military campaigns, perform rituals for the Khans, and mediate between the physical and spiritual worlds. Their presence ensured continuity in an empire undergoing constant transformation. The Mongols did not abandon their roots, they expanded them, creating a spiritual horizon broad enough to encompass the beliefs of millions. This mosaic of faiths did not exist merely side by side. It interacted, exchanged ideas, and created a cultural richness unmatched in the medieval world. In Karakoram, the imperial capital built by Urgadai Khan, one could find a mosque, a church, a Buddhist temple, and a Taoist shrine within the same district. Travelers from distant lands marveled at a city where priests of different religions debated theology in marketplaces, where scholars translated texts across cultural boundaries, where the Khans themselves attended ceremonies from multiple traditions. Karakoram became a crossroads of belief, a place where the divine was not monopolized but shared. This policy of tolerance also served as a powerful diplomatic tool. Rulers across Asia and Europe sought alliances with the Mongols in the hopes of gaining religious protection for their people. Popes wrote letters proposing joint crusades. Muslim sultans sent envoys seeking peace. Chinese Buddhist leaders courted favor, and Christian princes of Armenia and Georgia fought alongside Mongol generals, believing them to be liberators rather than conquerors. Religion, once a dividing line, became a bridge constructed by Mongol pragmatism and vision. Yet the Mongol approach to religion was not merely permissive, it was strategic. They understood that spiritual leaders held as much influence as kings. A respected lama, imam, priest, or shaman could calm a restless population or inflame a rebellion. By treating religious leaders with honor, by granting them privileges and autonomy, the Mongols secured loyalty across vast and diverse territories. They did not need to convert their subjects. They needed to ensure their subjects felt respected, and in that respect lay stability. But beneath this tapestry of tolerance lay a deeper philosophical truth. The Mongols believed that the world was too vast, too mysterious, too sacred to be captured by a single religious perspective. They believed that the eternal blue sky watched over all peoples, not just their own. This worldview created a humility rare in conquering empires, a recognition that divine wisdom could be found anywhere, in any tradition, from any culture. And so they listened, they learned, they absorbed insights from the religions they encountered, weaving them into the fabric of their empire. Some traditions flourished under their protection, others evolved. All were transformed by the unprecedented freedom to coexist. This coexistence created a golden age of intellectual exchange that strengthened the empire even as it diversified it. Scholars traveled freely, manuscripts crossed borders, and spiritual ideas circulated along the Silk Road with a vitality unseen since the days of ancient Persia and India. Over time, this atmosphere of mutual respect became one of the Mongols' most enduring legacies. Long after their armies ceased to thunder across the earth, long after their empire fractured into competing khanates, their tolerance survived in the memories of the people they ruled. Historians often focus on the violence of the Mongol conquests, but in monasteries from Tibet to Armenia, in mosques from Bukhara to Tabriz, in churches from Karakoram to Baghdad, one finds stories of protection, patronage, and cultural flourishing made possible by Mongol imagination. For in a world where empires rose through blood, the Mongols discovered a quieter, deeper strength. They learned that faith could bind as strongly as fear, that respect could govern more effectively than coercion, and that an empire built on diversity could endure where uniformity would break. Their policy of religious tolerance was not a footnote to their conquests, it was the foundation of their governance, the philosophy that allowed them to rule not simply as conquerors, but as stewards of cultures far older and more complex than their own. This was the Mongol miracle, not destruction, but acceptance, not suppression, but synthesis, not a single faith imposed by force, but an entire world allowed to breathe under the vastness of the eternal blue sky. And yet, even with all this openness, the Mongols did something even more radical, something that no other empire of their time dared attempt. They elevated neutrality itself into a governing principle. The Khans refused to bind their legitimacy to any single priesthood, any single scripture, any monopolizing doctrine. Their authority came not from divine endorsement, but from their own capacity to govern effectively. It was a revolutionary separation of spiritual power and political authority in a world where most kingdoms lived under the shadow of a single faith. In Europe, kings ruled by the grace of God. In the Islamic world, sultans held authority as protectors of the faith. In China, emperors claimed the mandate of heaven. But the Mongols claimed something else entirely, something at once humbler and more profound. They ruled by competence. They ruled by results. They believed Tengri granted a destiny only if a leader proved worthy of it through action, wisdom, and the stewardship of the people. Religion, therefore, was not a tool of rulership, but a landscape of human experience they had to manage with care. This philosophy allowed the empire to absorb entire civilizations without breaking them. When Mongol armies swept into regions with ancient temples or sacred sites, they often protected these places rather than destroying them. The Mongols could reduce a city to ashes if it resisted militarily, but once that city submitted, its temples stood untouched. Priests, monks, imams, and scholars were invited to court, their knowledge valued, their presence respected. This duality, ferocity in war, gentleness in governance, shocked chroniclers who could not reconcile the image of warriors who slaughtered armies but defended libraries, or who destroyed fortresses but protected monasteries. Even diplomacy between religions flourished under Mongol patronage. Christian monks translated Buddhist sutras, Muslim scholars debated Confucian ethics, Tibetan monks exchanged teachings with Taoist masters, and Nestorian priests wrote chronicles that blended Near Eastern perspectives with Asian history. The empire became a living crossroads, a place where belief systems did not merely coexist, but actively shaped and expanded one another. This intellectual blending created theories of the cosmos, medicine, morality, and governance that would ripple far beyond the empire's lifespan. Among the most remarkable outcomes of this coexistence was the emergence of multi-faith families within the elite. It was not rare for a Mongol prince to take a Christian wife, consult a Buddhist lama, sacrifice to ancestral spirits, and listen to Muslim astronomers all within a single month. This fluidity of belief, instead of creating confusion, cultivated an intellectual breadth rare in human history. To be Mongol was not to be tied to a single identity, it was to stand at the center of many, drawing strength from all. And as envoys from distant lands entered the Mongol domains, many found themselves stunned by what they encountered. They expected fanaticism and tyranny. Instead, they found debates between scholars of 4 or 5 religions held under the patronage of the same ruler. They found rulers who asked questions, who listened, who sought knowledge from every direction. They found an empire that refused to see the divine as a border, but rather as a thread that connected all humanity. This was the quiet revolution that reshaped Eurasia, not by force, but by insight. In the end, the Mongols' greatest spiritual contribution may not have been their tolerance itself, but the confidence they inspired in others to protect their own traditions. Because the empire allowed religions to flourish, these traditions survived centuries of turmoil and continued to evolve long after the Khans were gone, and in monasteries, mosques, temples, and shrines that still stand across Asia and Eastern Europe, echoes of this unexpected Mongol legacy remain whispers of a time when the conquerors of the world chose not to erase its faiths, but to shelter them. Long before the world understood what the Mongols were, long before chroniclers began writing their accounts of destruction and conquest, an invisible current was already taking shape beneath the surface of their expanding empire. It shimmered quietly beneath the thunder of hooves, beneath the smoke of fallen cities, beneath the fear that followed the Mongol armies like a shadow. It was a current not of war, but of exchange of knowledge, technology, culture, and ideas. A current that would flow across Eurasia with a force no empire had ever unleashed before. The Mongols did not invent the Silk Road, but they revived it with a ferocity and clarity unmatched in its long and tumultuous history. For centuries, the great routes connecting China to Persia and the Mediterranean had flickered in and out of use, obstructed by warring states, bandits, shifting alliances, and political suspicion. Trade existed, but precariously. Travelers moved, but cautiously. Knowledge spread, but unevenly, often swallowed by borders or lost in deserts. Then came the Mongols, an empire whose borders did not divide but connected, whose laws did not restrict movement but protected it, whose rulers valued information as deeply as they valued victory. Under their rule, the Silk Road was not merely reopened, it became something else entirely. A monumental artery of human interaction, the likes of which the medieval world had never seen. The vast distances that once separated civilizations no longer mattered. A merchant could travel from Dadu to Tabriz, from Samarkand to Kiev, from Baghdad to Karakorum, with unprecedented safety. And with him travelled ideas. Ideas that would spark revolutions in science, technology, medicine, maritime exploration, and warfare. This exchange was not accidental. It was engineered, encouraged, and amplified by a people who, despite their reputation for destruction, possessed a remarkable ability to recognize value in all its forms. The Mongols understood that knowledge itself was a kind of weapon, one that could strengthen an empire long after the swords were sheathed. And so they gathered scholars, engineers, artists, physicians, and artisans like precious resources. Conquered peoples were not merely absorbed, they were repurposed. Chinese engineers were relocated to Persia. Persian astronomers travelled to China. Arab physicians taught in Mongol courts. Syriac monks copied manuscripts in Central Asian libraries. Tibetan lamas debated with Taoist scholars. Everywhere cultures touched, merged, collided, and reformed in ways that would echo far beyond the empire's collapse. Gunpowder, once a secret guarded by Chinese alchemists, found its way westward. The Mongols adopted it first as a curiosity, then as a weapon, then as a tool of siegecraft that transformed the art of war. Chinese engineers taught Persian metalworkers to build explosive devices that could shatter city gates. Word of these weapons travelled further still, reaching the Islamic world and then Europe, where engineers would eventually develop firearms that forever altered the balance of power. Without the Mongols, this technology might have remained a localized innovation for centuries longer. Under their rule, it became a global force. Printing technology, too, rode the great wave of Mongol exchange. The Chinese had refined printing for centuries, but it was under the Yuan dynasty that printing reached a scale unseen in earlier empires. Government decrees, tax records, medical texts, Buddhist sutras, and multilingual dictionaries were produced in vast quantities. Papermaking spread westward, transforming the bureaucratic and literary cultures of Persia and the Middle East. In the centuries that followed, these technologies would help sow the seeds of the Renaissance and the scientific revolutions that reshaped the West. Astronomy flourished as Mongol rulers sought not only military advantage but an understanding of the heavens. They commissioned observatories that incorporated Chinese celestial charts, Persian mathematical models, and Islamic astronomical tools. The empire became a crucible in which scholars tested hypotheses, compared systems, and refined instruments. From this mixing of traditions emerged new calculations of planetary motion, improved calendars, and innovations in navigation that would guide traders and sailors long after the Mongols were gone. The compass, an invention that had matured in China, found new life as it travelled across the Mongol Empire. In the hands of Arab and Persian sailors, it became a vital tool for navigating the Indian Ocean. From there, it moved into the Mediterranean and eventually into the hands of European mariners who would one day sail beyond the edges of known maps. The Mongols, without ever embarking on oceanic voyages themselves, provided the conditions that made long-distance maritime exploration possible. Medicine, too, blossomed under Mongol rule. Chinese herbalists exchanged remedies with Arab physicians trained in the humoral system of Galen. Mongol shamans contributed knowledge of steppes plants, animal-based treatments, and ritual healing. The Ilkhanate courts in Persia produced medical encyclopedias that combined traditions from all corners of the empire. Hospitals arose in major cities, staffed by doctors who spoke several languages and practiced a fusion of medical techniques. In a world where disease recognized no borders, this blending of knowledge saved countless lives. These exchanges did not occur in a vacuum. They were propelled by policies that encouraged movement, encouraged dialogue, encouraged experimentation. The Mongols issued passports paisa that granted travelers passage and protection. They exempted scholars from taxes, fed them from the imperial treasury, and gave them audiences with the Khans. They offered patronage to craftsmen and materials to artisans. They demanded innovation from engineers and service from astronomers, but rewarded them lavishly in return. Their empire became a vast laboratory, a place where ideas could move faster than armies, and discoveries could cross mountains with a speed unthinkable in earlier eras. The Mongols were not always gentle nor always wise, but they were unmatched in their appetite for knowledge. They devoured it with the same intensity that they devoured territory, and like territory, they integrated it fully into their world. One of the most remarkable byproducts of this intellectual exchange was the rise of translation movements that rivaled those of ancient Baghdad or medieval Toledo. In the courts of Karakorum and later Dadu, teams of scholars translated Chinese works into Persian, Persian works into Mongolian, Sanskrit documents into Tibetan, and Arabic treatises into Uyghur. The empire became a linguistic crossroads where scribes juggled scripts from every major civilization of Eurasia: Arabic, Chinese, Uyghur, Persian, Syriac, Greek, Tibetan, Mongolian, and more. Knowledge that had once been confined within the boundaries of a single language now flowed freely across the empire. Yet, for all the sophistication of this exchange, its greatest effect may have been psychological. The Mongols created a world where the boundaries between civilizations blurred, where people saw in their rivals not enemies but sources of wisdom. A Buddhist monk could learn from a Muslim astronomer. A Persian poet could be inspired by Chinese painting. A Chinese engineer could collaborate with a Syrian architect. These encounters softened prejudices, expanded imaginations, and enriched artistic expression. Artistic traditions flourished not through preservation alone, but through reinvention. Persian miniature painters adopted Chinese motifs, dragons curling through cloud scrolls, landscapes rendered with ethereal brushwork. Chinese artisans incorporated Middle Eastern geometric patterns and new glazing techniques from Islamic pottery. Mongol textiles blended Central Asian colors with Chinese silks and Persian embroidery. This was not mere imitation, it was synthesis, a creative transformation born from encounters impossible in more isolated civilizations. The Mongols did not build great libraries to preserve knowledge as the Abbasids had done, but they created the conditions for a living exchange, dynamic, mobile, unpredictable. Knowledge was not stored, it was circulated, carried on horseback, passed hand to hand, and debated across languages and cultures. It lived not in stone but in motion. One of the most extraordinary results of this motion was the connection of scientific traditions that had evolved separately for centuries. Chinese records of eclipses were compared with Islamic astronomical tables. Persian mathematicians introduced algebraic concepts to Chinese scholars. Medical theories traveled between continents and were tested in new climates. Navigation techniques developed in the Indian Ocean merged with instrumentation refined in China. The intellectual map of the world expanded not through conquest but through curiosity. This exchange also had military implications. Mongol war engines became more sophisticated through Persian metallurgy, Chinese engineering, and Islamic chemistry. Protective armor evolved through the combination of lamellar designs with Persian metalwork. Even battlefield strategy absorbed ideas from conquered lands, becoming an ever-changing blend of ingenuity drawn from every corner of the empire. But the Mongols' greatest intellectual contribution lay not in any one invention or discovery, but in the environment they created: a world where knowledge was liberated from borders, where curiosity became a tool of governance, and where the exchange of ideas was not the privilege of an elite, but the everyday reality of merchants, travelers, artisans, and scholars. For a century, the Mongol Empire became the beating heart of Eurasia, pumping ideas along the arteries of the Silk Road, sustaining a cultural and scientific vitality that transformed the medieval world. Long after their empire disintegrated, the aftershocks of this exchange continued to reverberate. Gunpowder changed warfare, printing transformed literature and bureaucracy, navigational tools fueled exploration, medical knowledge saved lives across continents. Artistic fusion gave birth to new traditions, and the Silk Road, revitalized by Mongol rule, remained a highway of human connection that would shape the development of civilizations for centuries. The Mongols are remembered for their conquests, but their more enduring legacy lies in the world they connected. A world where ideas were free to travel, where genius could emerge anywhere, where cultures met not in isolation but in dialogue. Their empire, vast and violent, also became the first global network in human history, a place where knowledge flowed faster than armies and shaped the destiny of continents. It was, in its own way, the empire's greatest triumph, not the taking of land, but the sharing of wisdom. Yet even as ideas raced across the empire with unprecedented freedom, something subtler and perhaps even more transformative took place. It was not merely the movement of knowledge, but the reshaping of how people perceived knowledge itself. Civilizations that once guarded their discoveries with possessive jealousy now found themselves sharing, comparing, adapting, and improving upon one another's achievements under Mongol encouragement. The empire created a philosophical shift in the human imagination, the realization that wisdom was not the property of a single culture, but a light that grew brighter the more widely it was spread. Travelers who journeyed along the Mongol roads often wrote, with surprise, that people spoke multiple languages with ease. A merchant from Aleppo might converse in Persian, Uyghur, or Mongolian. A scholar from China might write commentary on Arabic texts. Ideas became fluid, passing through interpreters like water through channels. Where earlier kingdoms had feared foreign influence, the Mongols saw foreign brilliance as a resource to be collected, catalogued, and set into motion. Their empire became a vast, cosmopolitan workshop where the innovations of one region became the building blocks for progress in another. Even cuisine and agriculture were transformed by this movement. Spices from India travelled to the Mediterranean with greater consistency. Chinese tea reached Persia, while Persian melons and grapes found new life in the gardens of northern China. Silk production techniques migrated west. Cotton cultivation methods travelled east. Mongol herders learned irrigation methods from the Khwarezmians. Chinese farmers learned new breeds of livestock from the steppe. The agricultural bedrock of Eurasian life shifted, and with it shifted economies, diets, and even social structures. The exchange extended to philosophy as well. Confucian bureaucrats encountered Islamic political theory. Buddhist monks studied Greek-influenced logic preserved in Syriac manuscripts. Legal scholars in Persia debated with their Chinese counterparts about justice, administration, and the moral responsibilities of the state. These philosophical dialogues did not always produce harmony indeed. They often sparked fierce disagreement, but they produced something far more important, a widening of intellectual possibility. People became aware that the questions they asked had been asked by others, far away, in different tongues, framed in different traditions. The Mongol Empire made the world intellectually self-aware. This intellectual self-awareness also sparked new forms of storytelling. Poets in Persia incorporated Chinese imagery into their verses. Chinese poets wrote about the landscapes of Central Asia. Mongol bards, once confined to oral tradition, found themselves interacting with literate cultures and recording genealogies, epics, and histories in new written forms. Stories travelled along the Silk Road like living creatures, shedding skins and taking new shapes with every retelling. This was not the decline of tradition, but its evolution, a deepening of the human narrative through the friction and fusion of cultures. Perhaps the most unexpected impact of Mongol-era exchange was its influence on identity. People no longer saw themselves as isolated inhabitants of closed worlds, but as participants in a continental dialogue. A merchant in Bukhara might carry goods that originated in Fujian and were destined for Venice. A monk in Tibet might debate ideas that came from Baghdad. A metal worker in Tabriz might use techniques developed by engineers in northern China. Under Mongol rule, identity expanded beyond tribe or city or kingdom. It became something porous, something dynamic, something connected. And though the empire would eventually fracture, the psychological shift it ignited did not fade. It endured in the way maps were drawn, in the way trade routes stayed open, in the way intellectual traditions continued crossing borders long after the Khans had fallen silent. The Mongols had not merely opened the Silk Road, they had rewired the cultural nervous system of Eurasia. They had created a world where ideas could no longer be imprisoned by geography. Their legacy was not only the rise of new technologies or the spread of ancient knowledge, but the dawning realization that the story of humanity was not a set of isolated chapters, but a single, sprawling, epic, interconnected, interwoven, and alive. For all the power the Mongol Empire commanded, for all the territories it could crush beneath the thunder of hooves and bind together with the delicate threads of commerce, culture, and administration, its greatest vulnerability did not lie in the swords of its enemies. It lay within. Deep inside the empire's foundations, beneath the victories and the triumphs and the endless expanses of conquered land, a fracture waited quiet, invisible, inevitable. And when it finally split open, it was not the armies of foreign kingdoms that brought the empire to its knees, but the forces of ambition, ideology, and blood. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 was the spark that set this internal storm ablaze. Mongol had been a stabilizing force, firm, resolute, pragmatic. Under his leadership, the empire had continued to expand, and even its farthest frontiers felt the steady pressure of a ruler who knew that the greatest threat to the house of Genghis Khan came not from beyond its borders, but from the rivalries simmering inside it. When Mongol died unexpectedly during the siege of Diaoyu Castle in Sichuan, he left behind no designated successor, and in the Mongol world, the absence of a clear heir was not merely a political inconvenience, it was an invitation for chaos. Two figures stepped forward to claim the mantle of Great Khan: Kublai, the brother who had spent years in the sophisticated world of Chinese politics and administration, and Arik Bök, the brother who remained anchored in the traditions of the steppe, embodying the conservative heart of Mongol identity. Their conflict was not only a struggle for power, it was a struggle for the soul of the empire. Kublai represented transformation. He had lived among Chinese philosophers and officials, had studied the strategies of dynastic governance, had witnessed firsthand the magnitude of a sedentary civilization's administrative machinery. He saw that the future of rule over the vast Mongol domains could not rely solely on the old ways of the steppe. He envisioned an empire that blended Mongol military strength with Chinese bureaucratic sophistication, a new kind of imperial order capable of governing millions of farmers, artisans, scholars, and traders. Arik Böke stood for the old faith. To him, the strength of the empire came not from cities or archives or taxes, but from the horse, the bow, the open sky, and the traditions that had forged the Mongols into the conquerors of the world. He feared that adopting too much of Chinese culture would dilute Mongol identity, weakening the warrior spirit that had built the empire. He believed that the future lay not in transformation, but in preservation. Their conflict split the empire in two hemispheres, not geographically, but ideologically. Kublai summoned a Kurultai in his Chinese-controlled territory and was proclaimed Great Khan. Arik Bök summoned his own Kurultai in Karakorum, the ancient capital, where the traditionalists rallied behind him. Two brothers crowned themselves with the same title. Two visions collided, and an empire built on unity was torn open from within. The war that followed was unlike the Mongols' previous campaigns. It was not fought against foreign armies who trembled at the sight of their banners. It was a war of brothers, cousins, generals, and clans, people who spoke the same language, wore the same armor, and carried the same legacy in their blood. It was a war that did not promise glory, only sorrow. Kublai held the advantage of wealth, grain, and bureaucracy. His command of China's fertile agricultural lands gave him resources Arik Böke could not match. Arik Bök held the traditional capital, the loyalty of many powerful steppe aristocrats, and the symbolic legitimacy of the heartland. But symbols could not feed armies. Ideology could not supply horses. Tradition could not sustain endless campaigns. Supplies faltered. Allies defected. The nomadic base that had once been invincible found itself strained by a prolonged conflict that steppe logistics were never designed to support. Arik Böke's forces struggled to maintain cohesion. Internal tensions erupted as clans quarreled over allegiance, and rival princes maneuvered for advantage in the shifting landscape. After 4 years of grinding war, Arik Böke surrendered. His defeat marked more than the victory of a rival brother. It marked the victory of a new vision for the Mongol Empire. Kublai would go on to establish the Yuan dynasty in China, building a capital at Dadu that towered over the remnants of the old order. The Mongols had become rulers of the world's most populous sedentary civilization, an achievement that simultaneously elevated and diluted their identity. Yet, while the civil war had ended, its consequences had only begun. The unity that had allowed the Mongols to conquer continents was shattered. The empire was now too large, too culturally diverse, too geographically unwieldy to be dominated from a single center. The centrifugal forces that had long been restrained by the charisma of Genghis Khan and the discipline of his early successors now pulled with full strength. Regions that once bent easily to the authority of the Great Khan began to drift. The Golden Horde on the western steppes, already distant from Karakoram both in miles and in political interest, operated increasingly as an independent power. They maintained the ritual of acknowledging the Great Khan, but the acknowledgement was hollow, symbolic at best, irrelevant at worst. Their priorities lay in Russia, the Caucasus, and the steppes of Kazakhstan, far from the courts of China. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate charted its own path. It was a region defined by a mix of nomadic tradition and the ancient civilizations of the Silk Road. The Chagatai elite watched Kublai's adoption of Chinese customs with suspicion, seeing in it the erosion of the values that had once defined Mongol supremacy. Their loyalty fractured further as factional struggles plagued the region, each prince seeking to secure his own domain. To the south and west, the Ilkhanate emerged from the conquests of Hulegu, another grandson of Genghis Khan. Centered in Persia, it absorbed ancient cities, Islamic culture, and centuries of local governance. Its rulers, facing the administrative challenges of sedentary civilization, gradually embraced Islam, a transformation that drew the Ilkhanate further from the shamanistic and Buddhist influences of the Eastern Empire. As they integrated into the Islamic world, their ties to the Great Khan weakened, replaced by their own regional ambitions. And in the east, Kublai's Yuan dynasty became increasingly isolated. For all its grandeur, the Yuan court drifted away from its steppe roots, adopting Chinese rituals, titles, and institutions. The Mongol elite in China grew wealthy yet complacent, losing the mobility and flexibility that had once defined their military genius. Their empire, though magnificent, stood on foundations foreign to its origins. Thus, the Mongol Empire, once a single, breathing organism, began splitting into four distinct bodies: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in the western steppes and Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Each Khanate inherited a piece of the Mongol legacy, but each shaped that legacy according to its own circumstances. The empire no longer resembled a unified force. It resembled a constellation, four bright, powerful stars drifting farther apart with each passing year. Their conflicts with one another grew more frequent. Disputes over borders, grazing lands, trade routes, and legitimacy flared into battles. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate clashed repeatedly over control of the Caucasus, their armies devastating cities caught in the crossfire. The Chagatai Khanate oscillated between alliances and hostilities with its neighbors, driven by internal power struggles. Even the Yuan dynasty, far to the east, could not fully escape the tide of war, as rival claimants challenged its authority. These wars were not the swift, decisive campaigns the Mongols had once mastered. They were prolonged, draining conflicts that generated no glory, no expansion, no unity, only decline. Resources that might have strengthened the empire were instead consumed in fratricidal strife. Trade routes that had once thrived under the Pax Mongolica became vulnerable to disruption. The administrative coherence that had held the empire together began to unravel. The legacy of Genghis Khan, built through the unity of tribes, the brilliance of generals, and the clarity of vision, slowly dissolved in the currents of ambition and fragmentation. Yet, even as the empire fractured, something remarkable endured. The Khanate still carried within them the memory of a shared past, a connection forged through bloodlines, laws, and the remnants of a once unified world. They continued to influence one another through trade, diplomacy, and occasional alliances. The Mongol world had splintered, but it had not vanished. It had simply transformed, adapting to the realities of geography, culture, and time. The story of the Mongol Empire's fragmentation is not merely a tale of decline. It is a testament to the extraordinary pressures placed upon any power that attempts to rule the world. It reflects the limits of conquest, the fragility of unity, and the inevitability of change. For in the end, no empire, however vast, can outrun the forces of succession, ambition, and human nature. The Mongol Empire began as a storm, reached its height as a single, roaring thundercloud stretched across continents, and dissolved like all storms do, breaking into smaller tempests, each carrying fragments of the original power. It was not a fall, it was a transformation, violent, painful, and utterly human. And in the echoes of this transformation, the world that followed was forever changed. But even as the empire shattered into 4 great fragments, the true cost of the conflict emerged not in the battles themselves, but in the erosion of something far more fragile than territory: trust. The early Mongol Empire had been built on a brutal yet unwavering sense of loyalty. Loyalty to the lineage of Genghis Khan, loyalty to the laws he established, loyalty to the unity that had lifted them from scattered tribes into the masters of half the world. Once succession became a battlefield, that loyalty began to decay, replaced by something corrosive and impossible to reverse: suspicion. Khan questioned Khan. Brothers doubted brothers. Generals weighed their futures not by honor but by opportunity. For the first time in generations, Mongol leaders began to imagine destinies that diverged from the empire's collective path. Where once the Mongols had ridden as one storm, now they became competing winds, pulling in different directions, scattering the legacy they had inherited like dust across the steppe. As the Khanates settled into their separate orbits, their identities hardened. The Golden Horde looked westward, shaping itself into a power deeply connected with the Slavic world, the Volga forests, and the Black Sea steppes. Its Khans adopted Islam and traded with Italian merchants, forging ties that Genghis Khan could never have imagined. Their rule over Russia introduced new political structures, new economic systems, and new cultural influences that would shape the rise of Muscovy centuries later. In Persia, the Ilkhanate embraced Islamic scholarship with an intensity that transformed it into a center of philosophical and scientific advancement. Astronomers mapped the heavens with precision. Architects designed mosques that blended Mongol aesthetics with ancient Persian motifs. Poets wrote verses that intertwined nomadic memory with the mysticism of Sufi tradition. Yet beneath this flourishing cultural life lay a constant anxiety. How much of their Mongol identity should they retain, and how much should they surrender to rule effectively in a land so steeped in its own ancient traditions? Meanwhile, in the Chagatai Khanate, the struggle between old and new reached fever pitch. Some rulers sought to preserve the pure nomadic ethos of their forefathers, rejecting the sedentary influences that flowed through their territory. Others recognized that the world around them was changing, and that the Khanate could not remain frozen in the mindset of conquest forever. This tension produced a cycle of coups, assassinations, and shifting alliances that weakened the heart of Central Asia, making it vulnerable to powers that would later rise from the region's fractured core. The Yuan dynasty, for all its grandeur, faced challenges of its own. While it claimed the legacy of Genghis Khan, it sat atop a civilization far older, more populous, and more sophisticated than the Mongol system had ever been designed to govern. Kublai's successors struggled to maintain the balance between Mongol dominance and Chinese administrative reality. The empire they oversaw was dazzling, yet brittle, an opulent shell wrapped around a core that no longer beat with the rhythm of the steppe. The ruling elite became increasingly estranged from their nomadic roots, losing the unity and discipline that had once defined them. And yet, for all these differences, all these diverging paths, the Khanates were haunted by a paradox they could never escape. Though they ruled independently, they could not escape the shadow of the empire they had once been part of. Their economies were intertwined. Their borders touched ancient trade routes. Their rulers, despite their rivalries, bore the same ancestry. Their warriors still recited the names of Genghis Khan's generals. Their laws echoed the Yasa, even as new systems emerged around it. This paradox shaped their interactions part hostility, part kinship, part longing for a unity that could no longer be recovered. Diplomatic marriages were arranged to soothe disputes. Envoys carried letters referencing past glories, as though invoking shared memory might heal the fractures history had carved. But nostalgia could not repair the damage. Each Khanate had become too invested in its own survival to sacrifice anything for the sake of an empire that no longer existed. As generations passed, The memory of the united empire became a story. Parents told their children a story of thunderous conquest, of unbreakable brotherhood, of a world that had once trembled at the sight of a lone rider cresting the horizon. But stories cannot bind nations. The unity they described belonged to another age. Yet even in the empire's fragmentation, one truth remained undeniable. The Mongol Empire had been too vast, too explosive, too transformative to simply disappear. The world the Mongols had reshaped continued to evolve according to the forces they had unleashed. Regions they had conquered rebuilt themselves according to patterns the Mongols left behind. Political structures adapted, trade routes shifted, but they did not close. Cultures blended and remained blended. Even the wars between the Khanates unintentionally preserved part of their shared legacy. The fierce independence, the adaptability, the refusal to submit quietly to decline. The empire had broken, yes, but not into ruins. It had broken into new worlds, each shaped by the momentum of the Mongol past. The great storm had ended, but the winds it created continued to circle the globe. The Mongol Empire, which once unfurled across the world like a shadow cast by the sky itself, did not end with a single collapse, nor did it vanish in the blaze of one decisive defeat. Its decline was slower, quieter, more intricate, a gradual unravelling of threads, once woven tightly by conquest, diplomacy, and the relentless ambition of its early rulers. Like a great fire that had burned too hot and too fast, the empire began to smoulder, its embers glowing faintly in 1,000 places long after the blaze had passed. To understand its fall, one must trace not a single event, but a constellation of forces: economic strain, bureaucratic decay, cultural transformation, war, famine, pride, and time itself. And yet, even as the empire weakened, it left behind marks on the world so deep that no subsequent age could erase them. At the heart of its decline was a simple truth. Empires as vast as this one carry within them the seeds of their own undoing. The Mongols had conquered too much land, too many peoples, too many diverse worlds to bind together indefinitely. Administration required more than armies. It required resources, grain, taxes, labor, infrastructure, cooperation. And it required a unifying identity strong enough to transcend borders. When the empire was young, fear and loyalty to the house of Genghis Khan provided that unity. But as time passed, the heirs of the empire drifted away from the harsh simplicity of their ancestors. They settled, they grew comfortable, they became something other than what the steppe had made them. In China, the Yuan dynasty became the centerpiece of Mongol power, but it was also the clearest example of how Mongol identity became diluted. Kublai Khan had believed that governing China required embracing Chinese systems, Chinese rituals, Chinese administration, Chinese ideals. In one sense, he was right. The Yuan dynasty could not survive without the machinery of Chinese bureaucracy. But by adopting that machinery, the Mongols abandoned parts of themselves that had once allowed them to rule effectively. Their armies lost mobility. Their elite lost the rugged discipline of nomads. Their culture blurred with that of the people they governed. And over time, they alienated both Mongols and Chinese. The Mongols in China became a ruling minority that lived above, but not within, the society they claimed to rule. Their attempts to maintain ethnic hierarchy only deepened resentment. Their preference for foreign administrators angered scholars. Their heavy taxation strained farmers. Their inability to tame the floods of the Yellow River weakened their credibility. And while they patronized art, science, and culture, they also failed to integrate themselves into China's political psyche. To the Chinese, they remained outsiders. To the Mongols of the steppe, they had become foreigners in their own right. This tension became fatal. The Yuan dynasty rotted from the inside long before rebels rose against it. Corruption spread through its bureaucracy. Local officials sold positions and manipulated the tax system for personal gain. Court politics deteriorated into factionalism. The Mongol princes who once rode with fire in their hearts became idle nobles, absorbed in the pleasures of wealth. And when the Red Turban Rebellion erupted in the mid-14th century, fueled by famine, disease, and desperation, the Mongols found themselves unable to answer with the old ferocity. Their armies, once legendary for their unity and precision, now fractured under weak leadership. The great storm that had swept across continents centuries earlier now struggled to muster a breeze. In 1368, the Ming dynasty rose in triumph, driving the Mongols out of China. They fled north, back into the lands that had shaped them, but they did not return as conquerors. They returned as remnants scattered, disorganized, yearning for the past but unable to recreate it. The Yuan court in exile lingered for a time in Mongolia, calling itself the Northern Yuan, but it never again commanded the awe of the world. While the Yuan dynasty fell in the east, the Ilkhanate in Persia faced its own quiet catastrophe. Internal divisions, succession crises, and economic disruption weakened its core. The conversion of the Ilkhan rulers to Islam drew them into the complexities of Islamic politics, eroding their distinct identity while also entangling them in conflicts they could not manage. When the last Ilkhan died without an heir, Persia splintered into competing dynasties, each claiming legitimacy but none able to restore stability. Mongol rule faded there, not with a dramatic fall, but like sand slipping silently through fingers. The Golden Horde, once a formidable force dominating the Russian principalities and the steppes, suffered a longer, more agonizing decline. Its economy depended heavily on trade routes passing through the Black Sea and the Volga River. When the Genoese and Venetians shifted their commercial focus, when plagues swept through Eurasia, when internal factions battled for control, the Horde's foundations began to crumble. The rise of Muscovy dealt the final blow. Ivan III and Ivan IV pushed back, modernized their armies, centralizing power in ways the fragmented Horde could not counter. The former masters of Russia became trapped in a cycle of infighting and fragmentation, each successor state weaker than the last. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate fractured into eastern and western regions, each governed by rulers who fought bitterly for legitimacy. Some embraced Islam, some clung to older traditions, none could unify the land. The once mighty Mongol system of governance disintegrated, replaced by shifting alliances, tribal vendettas, and short-lived dynasties. The land that had once launched armies capable of terrifying kingdoms now struggled to maintain coherence. And yet, even as the political structures crumbled, the Mongol legacy endured in forms the conquerors could never have predicted. Their influence became sediment, sinking deep into the civilizations they had touched. In China, the Yuan dynasty left architectural innovations, administrative reforms, and cultural interactions that influenced later dynasties. In Persia, Mongol patronage of science, astronomy, medicine, and art created a renaissance that would later influence the Ottoman Empire. In Russia, the political centralization imposed by Mongol rule laid the groundwork for the rise of Moscow. In India, the memory of Mongol warfare shaped the strategies of the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughals. The Mongols had also reshaped global warfare. Armies across Eurasia adopted their cavalry techniques, their emphasis on mobility, their communication networks, their intelligence systems. Gunpowder, spread across continents through Mongol trade routes, revolutionized warfare. Fortifications changed in response to their siege engines. Strategies evolved, and generals feared that future conquerors might emulate the Mongol model, a fear that would echo for centuries. Their administrative ideas traveled as well. Concepts such as census-taking, religious tolerance, courier networks, and standardized taxation influenced emerging states long after the Khans were gone. Even the Mongol vision of a unified Eurasian world connected by trade, protected by law, open to cultural exchange, laid the foundations for what would eventually become global commerce. The Mongols did not merely conquer territory, they connected worlds. Even in decline, their memory was vast. Chroniclers struggled to reconcile the brutality of their conquests with the sophistication of their administration, the destruction they wrought with the exchange they promoted, the terror they commanded with the stability they created. Historians saw in them both devastation and renewal, darkness and illumination. They were an empire of contradictions, impossible to categorize neatly. And perhaps that is why their legacy endured beyond their political existence. The Mongols had forced the world to rethink its boundaries. They had shown that empires need not be built solely on common languages or shared religions. They had shown that power could come not from isolation, but from connection. Their downfall did not erase these lessons. If anything, it reinforced them, for as the world they had built fragmented, the systems they put in motion continued to operate. Trade routes stayed open, intellectual exchanges persisted, diplomatic networks evolved, cultural fusions deepened. The world, once divided by mountains, deserts, and suspicion, had learned to breathe as a single entity. Their fall reminds us that even the greatest empires cannot withstand the tides of time. But their legacy reminds us that influence does not end with collapse. Influence flows forward, shaping destinies unseen. The Mongol Empire began as a force of devastation and ended as a force of transformation. Its rulers died, its khanates dissolved, its banners faded from the wind, but its memory lived on in laws, in roads, in languages, in art, in science, in politics, in the very way civilizations imagined the shape of the world. No other empire in history disappeared so completely while leaving behind so much. The Mongols conquered through fire, they ruled through connection, and they fell through inevitability. But their echo, vast, haunting, immense, still moves across the continents they once united, reminding the world that even storms leave behind new landscapes when they pass. And yet, even as the Mongol Empire dissolved into memory, a deeper question lingered across the continents it once commanded. How could something so immense, so fierce, so omnipresent simply fade? How could a power that redefined borders and rewired civilizations collapse not with an explosion, but with a long, quiet sigh? The answer lies not only in politics or economics, but in something more subtle and more universal, the simple truth that the Mongols had changed the world so completely that the conditions that once allowed their empire to rise no longer existed. The world of Genghis Khan, a world of open steppes, fragmented kingdoms, slow-moving information, and rigid borders, was gone. In its place stood a new world, faster and more connected. Shaped by the very systems the Mongols had created, the empire had outrun the age that birthed it. It had transformed Eurasia into a landscape where knowledge flowed, where commerce linked distant cities, where ideas crossed borders with unprecedented freedom. Ironically, the empire became the architect of a world too complex for its original structure to govern. As its territories fractured, local cultures surged back with renewed strength, empowered rather than suppressed by their interactions with Mongol rule. Chinese scholars, long held at arm's length, adapted parts of the Mongol administrative vision and blended them with Confucian ideology, creating a more centralized and efficient Ming state. Persian scientists and artists, once funded and protected by Mongol patronage, continued to flourish, carrying forward the intellectual fire the Ilkhans had ignited. Even the Russian states, once humbled under Mongol dominance, emerged stronger, their leaders having learned the mechanics of tribute, military organization, and centralized command from their former overlords. This was the paradox of Mongol influence. Their decline fertilized the rise of new powers. The Ottomans, inheriting the crossroads of Asia and Europe, absorbed technologies and tactics that had passed through Mongol-controlled Persia. Their cannon, their use of mounted archers, their administrative systems all bore the faint fingerprints of lessons the Mongols had scattered across the region. The Delhi Sultanate, too, evolved under the shadow of Mongol threats, transforming itself into a more resilient, more militarized, and eventually more cosmopolitan state. When Babur founded the Mughal Empire centuries later, he did so consciously, invoking the legacy of Timur and, through Timur, the legacy of the Mongols. Even in India, far from the ancestral homeland of the steppe, the Mongols lived on in culture, lineage, and statecraft. Across Europe, the Mongol invasions had sparked a revolution of fear and curiosity. Chroniclers wrote of the Mongols as beings from another world, sent as divine punishment or apocalyptic prophecy. But fear gave way to study. Kings began to restructure their armies. Diplomats sought contact with distant courts. Traders reopened old routes and forged new ones. The Mongols had shown Europe how vast the world truly was and how vulnerable its kingdoms were. That awareness would later propel exploration, innovation, and the eventual expansion of European powers across the globe. But perhaps the greatest legacy lay not in the states that rose after the Mongols, but in the new shape of human consciousness. Before the Mongols, the world's civilizations lived as though sealed behind invisible walls. China developed independently from Persia. The Islamic world grew separately from Europe. India stood apart from the steppes. Ideas rarely traveled far, and when they did, they moved slowly. The Mongols tore down those walls, not just physically, but intellectually. They made the world one vast arena of exchange. They normalized long-distance travel, long-distance trade, long-distance diplomacy. They created expectations of movement and connection that no empire could fully reverse after their fall. Even disease rode these new highways, carried along the arteries of trade the Mongols had revived. The Black Death, unleashed by the interconnectedness of Eurasia, tore through populations with a ferocity unmatched in recorded history. It reshaped economies, societies, and demographics, contributing subtly yet powerfully to the shifting balance of global powers. The Mongols had not meant to spread plague yet. Even this catastrophe was part of the immense, unpredictable ripple effect of the world they built. As centuries passed, the memory of the unified empire blurred. Mongol princes became legends. Their battles became myths. Their cities became ruins swallowed by grass. But the systems they created did not die. They evolved, merged, and resurfaced in new forms across the world. The courier networks they pioneered became the early postal systems of the modern world. Their roads became the skeleton of transcontinental trade routes that would later fuel the Silk Road revival under Safavid, Ottoman, and Ming rule. Their policies of religious tolerance became a model rarely acknowledged, but deeply influential for later empires that sought to govern diverse populations without constant rebellion. Even the psychological imprint of their rise endured. The idea that the world could be united, however, temporarily left a scar on human history. Ambitious rulers from Timur to Napoleon, from the Mughals to the Russians, dreamed of recapturing the Mongol mantle, of restoring the illusion that the world could be ruled as a single breathing organism. None succeeded, but their ambitions spoke to the lingering spectre of the vast sky-wide empire that had once seemed unstoppable. In truth, the Mongol Empire never fully vanished. It dissolved into the soil of continents, into the architecture of governments, into the arteries of trade, into the vocabulary of warriors, into the dreams of conquerors, into the cultural DNA of nations from Korea to Hungary. Its fall was not an ending, it was a metamorphosis. And even now, when we look at the globe, its interconnected economies, its mingling cultures, its shared technologies, its instantaneous communication, we glimpse faint reflections of that long-ago world the Mongols forged through fire and vision. For the Mongol Empire was not merely a storm, it was a reorientation of the human condition, and long after its banners fell, the winds it set in motion still shape the world's horizon.